Um, well, so to get us going, let me introduce myself very quickly, being that we have quite a number of great speakers. My name is Dusan Marinkovic, and I am an international trade specialist with the U.S. Department of Commerce's U.S. Commercial Service, working out of our Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia office, where, amongst a few other sectors, I work with companies in the environmental technology space. So some of you may already know our organization, the U.S. Commercial Service, utilizes its network of about 100 domestic offices and another 130 offices around the world located at U.S. embassies and consulates to assist American businesses in entering new markets and increasing their international sales. You will hear more later in the program about some of our export promotion services that we provide to American companies, both in terms of helping them find suitable business partners abroad, as well as advocating for their business interests with foreign governments. My colleague Ryan Russell will go into a bit more detail on this later in the program. I'll just briefly mention here that while we regularly assist large companies, the vast majority of our exporting clients are actually small and medium-sized companies, and we are also focused on assisting businesses in traditionally underserved communities. So hence our partnership here with the Minority Business Development Agency. My goal today is to help facilitate this session. So real quick, a couple of housekeeping issues. All participants are in the listen-only mode. In the interest of time, we will take questions by utilizing the Q&A box located on the right of your screens. So please feel free to pose your questions at any time, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of the webinar after all the presentations. You will also notice that there is also a chat feature there, which you're welcome to use. But for questions, we kindly ask if you could use the Q&A box to ensure we can see your question and address it in a timely manner. We can provide responses in writing to any questions we are unable to address during today's presentation. If you have any questions or technical issues during the webinar, please feel free to send a direct chat to myself, the host, or to one of my colleagues who are also listed as panelists, either Olga Molnar or Erica Ramirez, and we will try to troubleshoot them as quickly as possible. Sorry, just was checking on some features here. So, and I just want to make sure that I mentioned that today's session is being recorded so that it can be shared with participants for future use. If anyone has any objections, please feel free to disconnect at this time. Everyone participating in today's webinar will receive copies of the PowerPoint presentations as well as a link to the recording. I think you will have a great opportunity today to hear about the opportunities and challenges in India's steel sector and its efforts to air pollution control and decarbonization. As we know, steel players across the globe are facing a decarbonization challenge. It is one of the most important engineering and construction materials. Currently, it is among the biggest producers of carbon dioxide, with steel plants being good candidates for decarbonization. Our colleagues in India have put together a great lineup of speakers from our U.S. government representatives on the ground and in the U.S. through our collaboration with the Institute of Clean Air Companies. You will hear from high-ranking officers at the Lois Group, the Texas-based Dastur Energy, as well as India-based ArcelorMittal Nippon Steel, Jindal Steel and Power, as well as the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So to get us started, it is my pleasure to turn it over to our Minister Counselor for Commercial Affairs in India. Ms. Eileen Nandi has over 20 years of experience promoting U.S. commercial growth internationally. And while she has worked in other trade development agencies such as the USTDA, as well as for our organization in various capacities and locations in Central America, a large part of her experience has been in different parts and regions in India. So she now holds our most senior title of Minister Counselor, overseeing U.S. commercial diplomacy and policy engagements with the government of India, managing our team across U.S. government agencies in 7 offices across the country. We're glad she was able to join us to provide opening remarks for this session. So Eileen, welcome, and please, you may begin.
Thank you so much, Dusan. Great to see you. Very good morning to the U.S. participants and good evening to the panelists on the Indian side. It's my great pleasure to be with you today. As you all know, the Biden administration puts a lot of stock in climate change, and there have been quite a few executive orders to help promote that. And the President Biden had very lofty goals, including having a carbon pollution-free power sector in the United States by the year 2035, and putting the United States on an irreversible path to a net zero economy by the year 2050. My organization, the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. We're the premier U.S. government agency dedicated to helping promote U.S. exports and helping U.S. companies create linkages in international business. We're focused on the export of U.S. goods and services across all sectors, but also environmental technologies and the steel sectors, which are the focus for this evening. The steel industry is very important for the United States, accounting for more than $520 billion in economic output and over 2 million jobs, including both direct and indirect jobs. It also generates over $130 billion in wages and benefits and over $56 billion in taxes. Likewise, steel is very important for India, and India will be a bright spot in the global steel production as the demand from construction, infrastructure, automotive, and other sectors increases. The industry, of course, had high capital expenditure and is an important end user for various categories of engineering equipment that U.S. companies excel in. But the main point is that the global steel industry contributes 6 to 9% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, which is one reason why we're doing this webinar today. It's on the roadmap to our collective goal for net zero. I'm extremely delighted that the Environmental Technologies team of the U.S. Commercial Service arranged this webinar today. We really have an all-star panel on the Indian side. I first want to thank Atanu Mukherjee, who I fondly recall from my Kolkata days. Thank you so much for moderating this panel. We have excellent panelists, Wim van Gerwen from ArcelorMittal Nippon Steel and VR Sharma from Jindal Steel and Power. We could not ask for a better panel, and I'm so excited for the interaction today. I'm also incredibly impressed that we have such great registration. We have over 80 companies registered, and I see that we have 57 participants, so well over half. So this is a great turnout. Also, this webinar has many promoters and supporters, but it was driven largely by our offices in Kolkata and Pittsburgh. So we had the two Rust Belt areas in our respective countries driving this. I also want to thank the Institute of Clean Air Companies in Virginia and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce in Kolkata. Thank you so much for your support. So I know this will be an incredibly enlightening discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you're speaking or listening. I wish this event all success. And for the U.S. companies on the line, please know that we are here to help you even after this webinar. So please do reach out to us in India or contact your local Export Assistance Center and let us know how we can help you in India and beyond. So thank you so much for having me, and I can't wait for the discussion.
All right, so now I would like to turn it over to my colleague in India, Mr. Arup Mitra, who is our Senior Commercial Specialist and Office Director in Kolkata. With experience in the steel industry and the focus on environmental technologies and climate change these days, for over 25 years, Arup has been working with the U.S. government, assisting U.S. companies in entering the Indian market. So he will introduce our next group of guest speakers who are joining us late from India today. Arup, please, you may begin. Thanks.
Thank you, and good morning to you, Ryan, and the US participants, and a very good evening to the Indian participants who are joining from India side. This is a very delightful moment for me. Being from Eastern India, as Eileen mentioned, while describing what we do as an organization, Eastern India and Pittsburgh are kind of seamlessly connected in the history of steel. And that is one reason why our office took the lead in conceptualizing and developing the program. For the US participants, just for your information, this region of India is actually the repository of all the raw materials that is required for an integrated steel industry to develop. And therefore, no surprise that some of the earliest steel industries of India developed from the eastern part of India. And now, of course, it is there in various other regions. Some of the leading companies are based here, and I'm very glad to see the leading steel companies of India represented in this webinar today. I will begin the introduction with Mr. Atanu Mukherjee, who is the moderator of the panel from the India side. Mr. Mukherjee is the CEO of Dastur Energy, which is a Texas-based company, and this is an affiliate of the Kolkata headquartered MN Dastur and Company, which is the eminent consulting organization for the steel sector for many, many years. Mr. Mukherjee works on energy transition challenges, industry strategy, carbon and climate engineering. He has worked with the US Department of Energy, the US National Carbon Capture Center, with the Government of India and the Government of UAE on policy, technology, and economics of gasification, methanol, hydrogen, and related carbon capture mechanisms for low carbon fuels, clean power, clean chemicals, clean steel, and the oil and gas industries. He brings a wealth of experience in the sector and related sectors, and we are very fortunate to have him as the moderator of today's session. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Mukherjee to begin the session, please.
Thank you, Arup. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I would start by saying that decarbonization of the steel industry in India is a very important aspect of continued sustainable steel production into the future. I would also say that it's important to understand that the nature of steel production will vary from region to region depending upon the economics, depending on the technology, depending upon the societal needs, depending on the market needs, depending upon raw materials and supply chains. And so what may be applicable in Japan or what may be applicable in the United States would probably be different of what may be applicable in India or, for that matter, UAE or some other country. So we need to have a very nuanced approach, which is practical, which makes business and economic sense, and which in the end addresses the goal of hopefully complete net negative decarbonized steel industry sometime in the future. However, we need to be very cognizant of the realities of steel making, of steel production as an essential commodity which drives the society, and especially so in a country like India, where the average consumption of steel is about 70 plus kgs per person, which is like 1/3 of the world average, and there's a long way to go. A country like India does not have sufficient availability of scrap because it's the stock of scrap per capita is very low. So EAF-based steel making is a big challenge. A country like India does not have natural gas resources, and natural gas is expensive in terms of its landed cost through LNG into India. So DR-based steel making is very expensive compared to what the purchasing power of people are for steel. And at the same time, we must understand that there's been significant investment of over $50 billion over the past 10 years in the integrated route, which cannot be stranded anytime soon, given the very basic nature of the economics of operation of any industry. And so keeping these constraints in mind and looking at the aspects of economics, business, society, and technology progression into the future, one must take a portfolio approach towards decarbonizing the steel industry in India so that we have an approach which makes sense from all aspects. And so here's one of the points that I think a lot of you have made, that steel is a hard to abate sector with no substitutes. And that's what makes it very hard. You cannot electrify steel making completely. You certainly can in certain areas to some degree, to certain volumes, but you cannot electrify your way out to steel making, at least in the foreseeable future, the next 15, 20 years. And so we need to have, what I said earlier, a portfolio-based approach of looking at how we are going to abate the CO2 from the steel industry, given what we have and given what we can do. And so here's, in India, steel, about 800 MTP of CO2 is probably going to be emitted if we continue the current trajectory, sometime by 2030 at a capacity of 300 million tons per annum. Now, that's a significant amount of CO2 under the current trajectory, and that is something that we need to be very concerned about, and we need to figure out what best can be done from an abatement perspective. And so in India, if you look at the CO2 emission intensity generally that we see from the different routes, VF-based routes, and of course, some of the secondary steel-based routes, if you combine that, it's about 2.6 tons per ton of CO2 per ton of steel, which is significantly high. NG-based, of course, is much lesser, 0.8, and scrap-based steel is 0.5 or lesser, which is fantastic, which is the case in the United States, like we heard from Bill. And I think that US will continue in that path to move forward. However, given the paucity of natural gas in India, given the paucity of scrap supply chains and scrap availability, and given the investment in blast furnace-based steelmaking, and given the availability of raw materials on blast furnace, one needs to take a very practical approach towards how we go about carbon abatement. And we think that one of the things that needs to happen has got to do with how do we really effectively utilize carbon capture, utilization and storage with the existing assets that we have got, that India has got, and also look at how we can use DR production through another endowment of coal with carbon capture to be able to create DR. And then, of course, use a combination of these, along with EAF technologies as it develops to create a whole portfolio over time to be able to eventually get to steel production, which is carbon neutral. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen-based steel, and I think absolutely that's going to happen. However, as all technologists in steel making and iron making know, that technology development in steel and market acceptance takes a lot of time. So while it is very impressive of what's happened in hydrogen-based steel making over the past 5 years, especially in Sweden, it's got to go before hydrogen becomes mainstream, given the logistical challenges, economic challenges, technological challenges, scale challenges, to be able to adopt hydrogen as a steelmaking medium for the future. The next slide, if you can, please. And so here's one example of what we are doing with at Burns Harbor plant in Cliffs with US DOE. And in fact, this is in the United States that we are looking at how do you decarbonize one of the largest blast furnace-based operations, using carbon capture technology and creating value-added products to be able to really support CO2 capture and decarbonize the integrated steel making at Burns Harbor plant in Indiana. And this is about 2.8 million tons of capture, using something called gas conditioning water gas shift, and then converting the waste gases into hydrogen, and using that hydrogen-rich gas drive things like combined cycle power plants, drive production of directly reduced iron, chemicals in the future, and potentially hydrogen as a pure fuel in the future. And this is one of the most, I think it's probably the pioneering flagship project in the world about how you create value from waste gas at the same time decarbonize, in this case, 75% or more, hopefully as a plan for 75% or more comes in from a 45Q credits perspective at $85 per ton. And so we think that this can be a forerunner in terms of driving CO2 as one CO2 capture and utilization as one mechanism of carbon abatement and the overall portfolio of things that one can do. And so we believe that this has got a long way to go. And I think this is particularly germane from an Indian perspective, where blast furnace-based operations in the foreseeable future is going to be perhaps quite pervasive and dominant, while being complemented with other technologies. So if you the next slide, please, if you can. And so if you look at the routes to transition, we think, and I'm sure we'll hear from our panelists, Mr. Wim van Gerwen and Mr. V.R. Sharma, on the different aspects, but generally we think that VF-based production needs to be decarbonized. It is a conventional route. It's got over 60% of share in the current Indian steel production. 100% carbon abatement is difficult, but you certainly can go to a significant amount of carbon abatement, close to 90 or more if the need so be, depending on the economics. Green hydrogen is the future at some point of time, but RE-based production does not make practical sense at this point of time, in our opinion. And I think while it is possible to do RE-based hydrogen production, the economics of production in terms of the green premium and the sheer scale, right? Like for example, 10 MTPA of production needs about 0.8 MTPA of RE hydrogen capacity, which is significantly large. And with 6 gigawatts of RE at continuous base load, is very difficult to do at this point of time. So it'll happen at some point of time, but not right now. So we need to figure out what is the path towards green hydrogen-based production of steel in the most optimal manner. And also the economics of hydrogen at $4 to $5 per kg is daunting, you know, on the current path. So we need to figure out ways to do that. And I think CGP-based production, which I think Mr. Virasha will talk a lot about, is probably a very practical way, although, you know, as you all might know, that coal is something that is not exactly
we can take.
Hello? Yeah, and so we need to go to CGP-based production as one of the routes. And so a combination of portfolio will give you an idea of how to go about carbon abatement in the steel industry in a manner which is economical, societally beneficial, market friendly, at the same time addresses climate goals, you know, for the world.